Hey there, history nerds and curious weirdos. Welcome back to Naked History Debrief, the companion show where we take off the powdered wig, loosen the corset, and hang out for a minute after the main story is over. I'm your host, Dyllan Gasaway, and this week we're following up on our episode about Victor Lustig, a smooth-talking con man who managed to do what sounds like the setup to a joke that absolutely should not have been possible. He sold the Eiffel Tower. Or at least he convinced somebody that he had. And if that sentence alone doesn't make you want to sit down and reevaluate the entire human species, well, I don't know what will. Because Victor Lustig is one of those figures who sounds made up. He feels fictional in the way that only real history can. If I wrote a character into a screenplay and had him pose as a government official, forge documents, manipulate class anxiety, exploit the greed, and then convince a businessman to secretly buy one of the most recognizable landmarks in Europe, somebody in that writer's room would absolutely go, okay, but tone it down a little. And yet, Victor Lustig did it. Or more accurately, he staged it well enough that somebody else did the rest of the work for him. And that, I think, is the really fascinating part. Because the more you sit with Victor Lustig, the more you realize this is not just a story about one guy being unusually good at lying. It's about how human beings are wired. It's about status, it's about secrecy, it's about that little dangerous voice in the back of your mind that says, this sounds suspicious, but what if it's also an incredible opportunity? And that voice has ruined so many people. Historically, financially, romantically, sometimes all three. So today, I want to talk a little bit about why scams like Lustig's work, and why people fall for this sort of a thing, and what made him such an effective manipulator, and why deep down, all of this feels uncomfortably modern. Then, of course, we'll wrap up with This Week in History, because nothing says I just learned about a legendary con artist like immediately pivoting into other moments where humanity made strange and dramatic choices. So let's get into it, shall we? So first, a couple of post-episode thoughts. Victor Lustig is one of those people where you have to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. One, he was undeniably brilliant in a very dark and predatory way. And two, he was still very much a criminal. Because I do think there's always a danger with figures like this, that we turn them into lovable rogues, a charming trickster, the gentleman scoundrel, the rascal with a forged letterhead. And yes, there is a cinematic quality to the story, there's a weird sort of elegance to the performance. And there's almost something artistically committed about selling the Eiffel Tower to a man who absolutely should have at least asked 4 more questions. But charming criminals are still criminals. A con artist doesn't just steal money, they steal confidence. They steal trust, they steal somebody's sense. The world basically makes sense. And that can linger a lot longer than the loss itself. Because getting conned is humiliating. It doesn't just hurt your bank account, it hurts your self-image. You don't just think, oh no, I've lost money. You think, what kind of a person am I that I let this happen? And that's the part that makes con artists so nasty. They often use the victim's own embarrassment as a shield. The more humiliating the setup, the less likely the victim is to come forward quickly. And Victor Lustig knew that at a high level. He didn't know just how to lie, he knew how to trap people inside the emotional aftermath of being lied to. And that's vicious. And honestly, that's probably one of the reasons the Eiffel Tower scam worked as well as it did. Because if you're a businessman trying to break into elite circles, and you secretly think that you've just bought the Eiffel Tower from a senior government official, and then 5 minutes later you realized, oh no, I haven't purchased a monument, I've purchased a problem. That's not an easy thing to report. And that's definitely not an easy police statement. You don't just walk into the station and say, hello, yes, I'd like to report a fraud, but first I do need to let you know that I was trying to privately buy the Eiffel Tower. There's no graceful version of that sentence, so yes, Victor Lustig was clever, but the more accurate word here might be predatory. Because he understood where vanity and shame overlap, and once you understand that, you can make people do incredible things. One thing I kept coming back to while working on this episode is that scams almost never work the way people imagine they work. We like to think the victims are gullible, or foolish, or uniquely naive. But that's not usually it. Usually a scam works because it's tailored to something deeply normal. Tailors to ambition, hope, impatience, greed even sometimes, but also insecurity, and loneliness, and the desire to matter. The one thing I kept coming back to while working on this episode is that scams almost never work the way people imagine they work. We like to think the victims are gullible, or foolish, or even uniquely naive. But that's usually not it. Usually a scam works because it's tailored to something deeply normal. It's tailored to hope, ambition, impatience, sometimes, yes, even greed, but also insecurity, and loneliness, and the desire to matter. A really effective con doesn't make you believe something random. It makes you believe something flattering. And that's a huge difference. Victor Lustig wasn't telling people, here's an obviously ridiculous idea, would you like to support it? He was telling them, you have been selected. You now have access, and you are special enough to be brought into the room where important things happen. And that's catnip to some people. People want to be insiders. They want to believe that the world has secret doors and that they, unlike all the regular idiots outside, have been invited through one of them. And that impulse is ancient. It's still everywhere. And honestly, the more that you think about it, the more Victor Lustig starts sounding less like an anomaly and more like the patron saint of every modern scam, with phrases like exclusive opportunity, private investment access, limited insider window, confidential pre-access. The language is everywhere because it works. It bypasses the part of our brain that asks, is this true? And goes straight to the part that asks, what if I miss out? And a fear of missing out has powered some of the dumbest human decisions ever made. Not all of them criminal, but many of them are. And also, I think one of the reasons people still love Victor Lustig's story is because it scratches a very specific itch. The fantasy that powerful or wealthy people can be outmaneuvered by somebody with nothing but nerve in a suit. And there's kind of a folktale energy to that. The rich guy gets humbled, the gatekeepers get embarrassed, and the pompous get outplayed. And sure, on the surface it can feel very satisfying, but what keeps the story interesting is that it's not actually a clean little guy versus the powerful tale. Because Lustig wasn't exposing a corrupt system in order to help the ordinary people. He was exploiting the cracks in the system for himself. He wasn't redistributing justice, he was billing it. And that's a very different thing. The other reason Lustig fascinates me is because he understood something that remains painfully relevant. Authority is often just performance with better furniture. Now, obviously, real institutions exist, the real officials exist, the real processes exist, but in everyday life, most of us aren't verifying power at a source every time we encounter it. We are just reading the signals. The suit, the office, the paperwork, the tone, the vocabulary, and the confidence, and the assumption that nobody would dare fake all of this. But of course, somebody would dare fake all of this, and that somebody is Victor Lustig. And not just him, historically, socially, constantly, human beings are very responsive to rituals of legitimacy. You put a logo on something and people relax. Put it on nice paper, they relax more. Hold the meeting in an upscale hotel, lower your voice, and add a little, "This is confidential." And suddenly everyone starts behaving like they're in a prestige drama instead of a scam. And that's not because people are stupid, it's because environments do psychological work on us. And Lustig understood staging. He knew that the con wasn't just words, the con was the room, the timing, the exclusivity, the implied status. He was basically directing a play where the victim didn't realize they'd already accepted a role. And that's what makes him feel almost modern in a media-savvy sort of way. He understood branding and he understood user experience. He understood that people don't respond to just facts, they respond to framing. Which is a sentence I wish did not make him sound like a criminal marketing genius, and yet here we are. There's also something really important about the corrupt official angle in the Eiffel Tower scam. Because Lustig didn't just pretend to be legitimate, he pretended to be plausibly compromised. And that's such a smart move. A perfectly clean government official deal might have sounded fake, too tidy, it was too formal, definitely too sterile. But a slightly grubby one with a whispered bribe and some discreet back-channel nonsense, now that feels real. Because corruption, sadly, often feels more believable than integrity. And that little touch gave the whole thing texture. It made it feel like how powerful decisions really happen. And that is such a sinisterly accurate read of how most people interpret institutions. I also think this episode lands because you can draw a straight line from Victor Lustig to the present day without breaking a sweat. He sold exclusivity, he sold urgency, he sold insider access. He sold the emotional thrill of being chosen, and that model never went away. The technology changes, sure, and the fonts definitely get uglier and the grammar gets worse. The scam emails somehow still manage to contain both too many capital letters and not enough punctuation, but the structure's immortal. You are special. You got in early, and nobody else knows yet. Move fast, don't ask too many questions, and trust me. That's the blueprint. The platform changes, but the skeleton stays the same. And if I can get a tiny bit serious for a second, that's the reason stories like this matter beyond the entertainment value. Because once you understand the mechanics of a con, you start spotting the pressure points elsewhere. Who is flattering your ego? Who is making urgency do the heavy lifting? Who is trying to isolate you from outside verification? Who keeps emphasizing secrecy? And who benefits if you feel too embarrassed to ask a basic question? Those are useful historical questions, but they're also very useful life questions. History does this all the time. It gives you a colorful old story about a count who wasn't a count and a tower that was for sale but wasn't, and then quietly hands you a flashlight for the present. It's very polite of it, honestly. And now it's time for This Week in History, the segment where we take a quick tour through a few other notable moments from this week in history, and remember that every week in human history contains at least one astonishing decision. On March 23, 1775, Patrick Henry delivers his famous speech to the Second Virginia Convention, ending with one of the most recognizable lines in American history, "Give me liberty or give me death." And look, whether or not every word was preserved exactly as spoken, the speech has lived because it captured the emotional temperature of the moment so perfectly. And historically, this is one of the all-time great examples of a man absolutely refusing to keep the drama setting below minimum. Subtle? No. Memorable? Yeah. March 24th, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The oil tanker Exxon Valdez runs aground in Alaska's Prince William Sound, causing one of the most devastating environmental disasters in U.S. history. This is one of those events that instantly becomes bigger than the headline. It's not just an accident, it becomes a story about environmental vulnerability, corporate responsibility, cleanup failures, and a long afterlife of ecological damage. History is often like that. One bad night, one bad decision, one cascading disaster, and the consequences stretch for decades. On March 25, 1911, a fire breaks out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City, killing 146 garment workers, many of them young immigrant women. This is one of the bleakest and most important labor tragedies in U.S. history. It exposed brutal workplace conditions, locked exits, poor safety planning, and the human cost of industrial indifference. And it remains one of those moments that reminds us that regulations are very often written in blood. If someone says safety rules are annoying, well, history would like a word. March 26, 1979, Egypt and Israel sign a peace treaty in Washington, D.C. following the Camp David Accords. This is one of those diplomatic moments that can sound almost tidy in retrospect, but at the time it was enormous, difficult, fragile, and politically risky. It reshaped regional politics and remains one of the most significant peace agreements in modern Middle East history. History loves to act like outcomes were inevitable after the fact. They rarely are. On March 27, 1964, a massive earthquake, the strongest ever recorded in North American history, strikes Alaska. And this is one of those events where human language starts to fail a little. You can say magnitude, you can say destruction, you can say tsunami, landslides, collapsed infrastructure, but there are moments in history where scale becomes almost hard to emotionally possess. Nature occasionally reminds humanity that we are, in fact, living on a very active rock. Sometimes that rock has opinions. On March 28, 1979, the 3 Mile Island incident occurs. A partial meltdown occurs at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, becoming the most serious incident in the history of the U.S. commercial nuclear power industry. It's another one of those moments where the event itself matters, but so does the fear around it. Public trust, technical systems, crisis communication, energy policy, all of it gets pulled into the blast radius. Also, if there is one reoccurring theme in modern history, it's that people get very uncomfortable when the phrase partial meltdown enters the news cycle, and reasonably so. I will say, on a purely personal level, Victor Lustig is one of those historical figures I would never want to meet, and yet absolutely would want to observe from, behind very thick glass. Because what do you even do with a person like that? He's probably charming, he's probably funny, and he probably knows exactly what to say to make you feel smart in the first 30 seconds. And then 45 minutes later, you realize he's somehow convinced you to co-sign a wildly illegal deal involving either a landmark, a machine that duplicates money, or an investment opportunity with discrete political advantages. No thank you. I do not have the emotional immune system for that. There's also something very funny about the fact that so much of his success came down to people seeing confidence and mistaking it for truth, which, to be fair, remains one of the most stable patterns in all of human civilization. If somebody stands up straight, walks, talks smoothly, uses 10% more certainty than the situation justifies, and half of that room just goes, well, it seems like they know. And do they? Well, maybe. Or maybe they're about to sell you a monument. And that's why skepticism matters. Not cynicism exactly, but skepticism. That quiet little instinct that asks, can someone else verify this? What's the secret? What's the urgency? Why is this person trying so hard to make me feel special instead of informed? And those questions save people. And they would have saved at least one Eiffel Tower related businessman. But that is it for this week's Naked History Debrief. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you're following the show and share it with someone who would absolutely be vulnerable to the phrase exclusive confidential opportunity. Next time we'll crack open another strange corner of the past, because history is full of geniuses, disasters, weirdos, visionaries, and liars, and occasionally one person who somehow manages to be all five at once. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and maybe don't try to buy internationally famous landmarks from men with good posture. I'm Dyllan Gasaway, and I'll see you next time.